Welcome to the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. The following presentation, entitled AI Ethics, Safety and Regulation, took place on February the 12th, 2025 at the Aerospace Engineering Sciences Building on CU Boulder's East Campus. Presentations were made by Robert Monaco, Philip Butler, Representative Brianna Titone, and Henriette Cramer. Chapter markers are provided below in the description field for you to navigate to each of these presentations. And a big shout out and thanks to Ken, who did a wonderful job of emceeing the event.
So we're going to start off with Robert giving us a very short what's new in AI governance. Philip Butler is going to be talking about the Seekr Project. I'll do longer intros when we actually get to the individuals. Representative Brianna Titone is here, who's going to be talking about Colorado and the state of all the states' AI regulation. And we've got someone coming in remote to talk about AI trust and safety in practice, Henriette Cramer, who was the basically founded some of the teams at Spotify related to AI and is now in private practice. And then at the end, because we've had a lot of questions about AI regulation, we're going to have a panel that's going to focus mostly on AI regulation, but we'll open it for all questions. Okay, and so all the folks here, and we've got one more special guest who's spoken recently, who's actually going to join for that. Okay, so we're going to start off with Robert Monaco.
Okay.
Okay.
How's everybody doing?
I'll let you introduce yourself because you got a lot on your slide.
Yeah, we're not going to stay on this slide very long. But this is me. I live in Boulder. I started to get interested in AI ethics a while back, I guess like 3 years ago. Met Ken at one of these events and started digging into just everything related to what could go wrong, what could go right. I've been fascinated with AI for a very long time. I worked at IBM early on a Watson team, doing business development back when people were like, what are you trying to talk to me about in like 2012? And most recently, I just took a job as the AI solution sales leader for a large technology service integrator called Converge. And I'm excited to talk to you guys about this. I've actually provided this presentation at a Boulder Build. I don't know if anyone goes to those, but some of these slides will look familiar. Governance is not regulation. It's governance. It's decision processes and building decisions into the right places when you're doing something in order to have and guide a positive outcome, right? So we govern. We're very different in the United States compared to the EU, right? So in the EU, it's called the Brussels effect. They essentially create these regulations, and those regulations tend to roll around the world. People have to pay attention because there's tens of millions of citizens that are protected under these regulations, whether it's genetically modified food or it's AI. The EU leads with a regulation policy. Whereas in the United States, we are a little less heavy-handed with regulation. We're more about self-governing and then litigation. So how many people here are lawyers? Any lawyers in the room? I know we have one. There we go. So companies mess up, companies get to self-govern. When companies mess up, hopefully the rule of law steps in and says, hey, you caused some harms here. Let's remediate that. The unacceptable risk in the EU AI space, that just hit February 2nd, right? So it's now, if you have a system that falls under the category of social scoring, mass surveillance, manipulation of behavior, causing harms, that system needs to be taken down or you're going to receive penalties. The other thing the EU just enacted was you have to create AI literacy within all of your employees. So if you've got operations in Europe, you now need to educate people about AI. The stuff on the right to you is NIST, right? So map, measure, manage, govern. This is the NIST framework. You can grab it, you can read into it. It's self-governance. It's a suggestion to corporations, to entities and organizations on how they can go about implementing safe and ethical AI. If you're planning to operate in the EU, you can grab that. It's a compliance checker so that you can see if your AI systems comply. It's a pretty cool little tool. We're going to cover this in detail when our state representative comes up and provides us an overview of what's going on. But there are laws happening across the board, all 50 states. Somebody's talking about something. I don't want to steal any thunder from the next presentation. And then the last piece is that we've got a global AI landscape. So every single country, anyone who's developing an AI understands that it's important to have some governance, ethics, and safety behind what they're doing. This is crazy to me, so this is editorial, but we've gone from safety to superiority as our policy for AI. We literally had a very detailed, policy-oriented, very specific paper. You could parse through the politics that were woven into that paper, and some of it I think had to come out, but we kind of like moved the pendulum in the other direction in a way that doesn't make any sense to me, because if you dig into the policy of the new paper, there is no policy except let's build AI to make America great again. So anyway, that is something to look at, because our policy direction as a federal government has changed significantly. The last is around NIST. This management framework basically helps organizations do this right. Do governance right and do safety right. They've done a lot of work to put this together. They started doing this stuff with security, really, and cybersecurity, and the frameworks around that. So there's a ton of experience there. And that's it. That's the state of governance right now to set up the rest of our speakers. So build with intention and be kind. That's it.
All right, thank you. Okay. All right, whoops, wrong direction as usual. All right, so now I have to open my phone so I actually have the descriptions that I wrote out for everybody. Oh, come on, open. All right, so our first speaker today is Philip Butler. Philip Butler is a researcher and founder of the Seekr Project, which you're going to learn more about in just a moment. He is a theology and AI professor. It's an interesting thought, at the Iliff School of Theology. He's an international scholar whose work primarily focuses on the intersection of neuroscience, technology, spirituality, and Blackness. He uses the wisdom of these spaces to engage in critical and constructive analysis on Black posthumanism, artificial intelligence, and pluriversal future realities. And no, you don't need to know what all those terms mean in order to enjoy the speech. No. Okay, so we're going to start off with Philip. Go ahead and take it. He's going to talk about the Seekr Project, which is a distinctly Black conversational artificial intelligence with mental health capacities.
How we do? Can everybody hear me? No? All right, let's try this thing. How about this? This is better? You're gonna make me hold this, huh? All right,
let me
cool. No, it's fine, it's just cool.
You just attach it right there.
You sure?
Yeah, I'll get it.
All right.
Oh, no, don't drop it. Yeah, I always have to have somebody do this for me. Oh, it doesn't want to hang there.
No, it doesn't.
All right, there we go.
Still good? All right, how about you in the back? All right, can we get a wave? Going this way? No, it's just a joke. No, but thank you all for having me tonight, Ken. Thanks for extending the invitation. Today, just gonna go briefly, tell you a little bit about how this came about. So I did my PhD work at Claremont School of Theology out in the IE in SoCal, and my coursework was bookended by Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and all the stuff in between. And so I went there to initially just study neuroscience and spirituality, but I had to do some reflection on what that meant for me to do this work. And so I thought about, what's up? It's not coming through? It's fine, I'll hold it. So I thought about the things that were important to me and what's not going anywhere. So I thought about my culture, the people that I claim and that claim me. And then I also thought about what's not going anywhere and what are my interests in that. And the thing that I thought was not going anywhere was technology. And so broadly, I'm interested in technology, but as this particular rabbit hole that I've gone down has led me right to artificial intelligence. And so writing the dissertation on one hand, on the back end, we started Seekr. And what it was a geographic application that would just try to get people to feel connected to the thing that was help them to be spiritually grounded. And so you would have a selector of like a intention for the day, and you find your sacred entity. And the idea was, depending on where you were, if you were in that space for longer than 5 minutes, you get a notification, and say you picked like God, if you like God. And say you pick strength, if that's what you wanted that day. You get a notification, you pick up your phone, and like, hey, the strength of God is with you right now. And it's just kind of that go throughout the day. And we were thinking about the future of this, and we were like, maybe chatbots would be helpful. And this is mine is 2017, where chatbots is primarily like decision tree based, nothing like what we have now. And then you fast forward to some of the work I was doing with ILIF and when they were building the AI Institute, which we have now. And the work that I do around Black transhumanism, the question for me that I like to play around with is like, what is a human? And I've come to the conclusion that humans don't exist. And we can have a conversation about that later if you like. But all of that primarily suggests is that anything that we have, whether it be socially or physically constructed, are an extension of our particular cybernetic frameworks. When we start looking at about artificial intelligence and spirituality, what I was attempting to do was find a way to bring the spiritual wisdoms that I had gained while at CST and find a way to bring them to people at scale, because I'd learned something. Anybody familiar with internal family systems therapy, IFS? Yeah, I was introduced to IFS back in 2013, and it was super transformative for me. And I also know that growing up, I went to church a lot, don't go to church anymore, but at the same time, the idea was that these particular tools and ways of approaching myself and the people that I come in contact with are not something that everybody readily is aware of or has access to. And so the idea is that if we can build robots that are capable of holding space for people and creating a dialogue, whether it be internally or not, that allows for this transformative kind of capacity to transpire, it was something that we'd like to do. And so when we started looking at models and the way that they were beginning to take shape, we also recognized that these things were primarily coded and created by certain people, and the way that they were presented also reflected their particular ways of life. But that means that there's a huge swath of ways of lives that were not necessarily incorporated within that. And so we were thinking about the ways that, especially within mental health or spiritual spaces, primarily in the clinical realm, there are, I think, less than 4% of clinicians are Black or capable of helping Black folks in this particular realm. But we also recognize, similarly, kind of coinciding within the context of the pandemic and post-pandemic spaces, that more and more people are attempting to seek therapy, but still don't have access to that. And I think even today, you have anywhere from like a week to like a year in terms of a waiting list of getting to see a clinician. So when we were thinking about all of this and the ways that AI have been primarily constructed for one particular mode of folks, we began thinking about deconstructing the end user and then also reimagining how we can bring these modalities to various ways. So here's what we've been doing over the last 3 years. And I think at the end of 21, beginning of 22, we began to compile about 120 years worth of Black literature. So you can think about anyone from like Sojourner Truth all the way to like Donald Glover's like Atlanta series that was on FX, and the things in between. And so we compiled that data set, we organized it, structured it, tokenized it, all that jazz. And by the end of 23, we turned that data set into a language model. Now, mind you, that language model was tiered out into 4 different eras. We had it the turn of the 20th century, early to mid 20th century, civil rights era, and then the 80s to the present. And so you could talk to it and it would respond in the voices of the authors, or at least the contextual frameworks linguistically of those time periods. And we were like, this is really cool. And then here we go with, the expansion of augmented RAGs and these the way the degenerate frameworks are now. And we have this agent that I'll show a bit of a demo in a second. But what we've done here with this particular this particular agent is we've included that linguistic framework, modernized it so it primarily functions off of the 80s to the present, linguistic colloquialisms, and then we've trained it on IFS and a couple other modalities. so that it can hold space for people. And I think we played around with giving it a persona. It happens to be a Falcons fan. As you can tell, I am not a Falcons fan, but we wanted to make it relatable in this way. I've mentioned in other spaces that we kind of wanted to provide kind of a bit of a barbershop wisdom that does not sound clinical. And so in that sense, what we hope to see today while we're playing around is a little bit of space holding that reflects a certain way of life. And so is that okay if we delve into that real quick? Yes. Awesome. Now, all right. Do this. So can I just type on this one now? Okay, spectacular. Does anybody have any emotions they want to play with today?
So it's an extended display, so whatever you see on here is going to be projected.
Perfect.
So you can just type.
Thank you so much, sir. What you got?
I just wanted to say I like your hat too.
It was a great game. Yeah, it reminded me of like when the Seahawks beat the Broncos. Not to, it had to be said. Sorry. But are there any emotions anybody wants to have an idea? What you got?
Fear.
Fear? What are we afraid of in particular?
Trump administration.
All right, I'm gonna try to do this without being too loud. All right. I'm afraid. It's thinking.
What's got you feeling afraid right now? I hear you. The Trump administration's been making some big moves lately, like trying to shut down USAID and freezing foreign aid. Folks are feeling uneasy because these changes can shake things up globally and at home. It's normal to feel concerned when things seem unpredictable. If you want to talk more about it or how it's affecting you, I'm here.
You just have to scroll so you can pretend the mouse is connected to the line.
Spectacular. Where do you want to go from there? Think they might defund? All right, so we got defund. I saw one more hand raised.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to move on to
One more. What don't we want them to defund now, specifically? Research? All right.
what is most likely, what Trump is most likely to defund.
Ooh. Let's see if we can mix the two. She said, wait.
I hear you. There's a lot on the line when it comes to research funding. Looks like for now, a judge has put a block on those cuts, giving some breathing room to folks in your shoes. It's a tough spot, but how are you feeling about this temporary relief?
Let's just say not good.
I feel you. It's tough when things are up in the air like this, especially with something as critical as research funding. Even with the judge's block, it sounds like there's still a lot of uncertainty hanging over your head. How are you managing to keep things moving forward despite all this instability?
Do we have an answer?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm steering in a slightly different direction, but given what you said about the model, I'd be really interested to hear what it thinks about what's happening with the DEI initiatives and the ripple effect from the government.
Let's see what it says.
Oh, wait, it's not typing.
There we go. Oh, snap. Let's see if we can adjust to my lack of spelling.
Yeah, I get why you're worried. The Trump administration's been cutting day initiatives left and right, making it tough for programs that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion to get federal funding. It's like they're trying to roll back the clock on progress. How's that sitting with you? Man, it sounds like these changes are really hitting hard. With the Trump administration cutting day initiatives, it's like they're stripping support from under many important programs, especially in research and education. How do you see this affecting the direction or future of your work?
I really like how the very last sentence every time is a question, bringing it back to you, how you're feeling, and how it maybe can help you get, like, make positive strides forward. That's a really good channel, or a really good thing.
Thank you. The idea is that on a basic level, right, you have the answer. And so, in part of attempting to hold space, it's like, you see a sense of validation, maybe reframing the question, and then posing another one, so that it, gives you the opportunity to sit with what might be the answer for you. Yeah. We got about a minute and a half left. Okay.
So you don't have to do this, but I'm curious. Thinking about the model and how it's trained.
Yeah.
So a lot of our work is in East Oakland, Black Game Act, a lot of our work is in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
I'm wondering if we can flag, like, I'm worried that our projects in East Oakland are getting black men and Sub-Saharan Africa aren't going to come.
Okay.
Which is my worry, one of my many worries, that's fine. I'm curious if it's going to start to pick up some of the actual model training in a way that lets us, as white people, see some of the things that might do this.
I think that's a good question, and I don't think it's I don't think that's out of the scope. But I think it brings to the fore something I also like to highlight, right? Like when we see like normal, normal models or agents brought to the fore, one of the expectations is that everybody gets to use them. And so even in doing this, what we often find, so I got one and then two, now I got you, is that this is just the construction of one particular kind of like wave perspective, but it's still something I think that anybody can use, right? It wouldn't put a cap on who the end user would be. Yeah. Did you have something? Sure. And so I'll type that while we listen to the last person, and then we're coming up on I got an extra 30 seconds. You're very kind. And so we'll wrap. I think we'll wrap there. But I also wanted to highlight you can access this now for free. It's seekrbot.com, where you'll just have to use the code. So right now our Google single sign-on is acting up. But if you go to seekrbot.com, you'll be able to play around and get your own kind of conversation with that. But I'll switch to for you. But sir, what was your question?
Yeah, you mentioned spirituality. How did you incorporate like spirituality and all that?
Yeah, so I think, so without pulling out, so I have like a much longer prezo, and you'll see there was this one slide, I asked it one day, I was like, something to the effect of, you ever stared off into the distance before? And it's like, basically the summation, we had a conversation about what does it mean to like be in tune with the universe and the stars. And mind you, these aren't pre-prompted things, right? This was kind of out of its own, ruminations or calculations, so to speak, depending on how you like to frame it. And so I think there's a very base level sense of what that is. But if you can, like I said, if you have the opportunity to hang out with it a little bit, I think you'll get a better sense of that for yourself. Yeah.
So I've got one question for you.
What's up?
So have you had a chance to determine like how the answers coming back from this language model are actually differing from just a typical trained ChatGPT model? Do you have any feelings on that, or what have you noticed?
So I think given what it's been trained on, right, the outputs are going to be like I think there's in some ways like a very stark difference in terms of like what it chooses to focus on, the metaphors that it deploys, and even right the ways that it reflects back the conversation and attempts to arrive at different solutions. And so I think you'll be able to tell in many ways, and especially if you were to engage in a bit of a joking battle, we added a roasting function. And so if you like to have a battle of wits with it, I'd love to hear how those go for you. But yeah, we tried to incorporate a few of those different aspects as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. We'll be seeing Philip again on the panel.
Sorry.
Is Dan here? Where'd Dan go? Hook up Brianna. Okay. I'm going to rearrange a few things here, get back to the slides. It's all good. Yep.
But then you have to click on this again, so it becomes the actual.
And it made it the next slide, which is what I wanted. So all good. All right, so let me introduce, by the way, two of the speakers, Brianna and Philip, I've been trying to get here for a really long time. So I'm very excited that they finally had the time to actually come and present. So Brianna is the House sponsor of the Colorado AI Act, which we keep referring to as SB 205 for those of us who are less informed. She was elected in 2018 to represent House District 27 and is serving her fourth and final term. She's term limiting out in House District 27. She serves as the chair of the Joint Technology Committee, on which she's served since 2019. She's also vice chair of the Finance Committee and a member of the Appropriations Committee. Rep. Titone has bachelor's degrees in physics and geology with a minor in mathematics, a master's degree in low temperature aqueous geochemistry, don't ask me, and a master's degree in information communication technology. She's been a geological consultant, a researcher, and a software developer, which makes her uniquely appropriate for this crowd. And they've given her, these things have given her a solid foundation to tackle a variety of complex policy topics to better the lives of Coloradoans. So with that, let me introduce Brianna Titone. And I asked Brianna to start off with a quick overview of 205. So this is the overview of 205, and then she's going to get into some related areas.
All right. Yeah. How's that? Is that good? Maybe I should move that a little bit. This thing really wants to keep flopping over to the side. It's not just sitting right. All right. I think that's better. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Representative Titone, state representative. Northern Jefferson County is where I represent, and this is a topic that a lot of people want to talk to me about. I talked to some lobbyists just the other day. They bug me a lot about it. Why do we need AI regulation in the first place? Well, it could be really dangerous. It can be really harmful if we don't actually put some guide rails on what it can do. And that's what a large group of legislators from around the country started to do in the last couple of years. The Senate sponsor, Robert Rodriguez, he was the prime sponsor in the Senate. He worked with Senator Maroney and others to try to find a universal policy that states could adopt all across the country. And Colorado was the only one who actually got it passed. So we passed this bill last year in 2024, and we focused on what we are considering high risk and consequential decisions in AI. And there's a lot of different ways you can regulate AI, because you can do the generative stuff, you could do all the different things. We wanted to really focus it on things that impact our constituents in the most impactful way. And that might be you not getting a job or a loan or insurance or things like this could really impact your life in a negative way without any kind of human oversight in that process. We know that there's bias in the algorithms that are trained to produce these outcomes, and we want to be sure that the companies that are producing these kinds of solutions are being mindful of that and trying to mitigate that as much as possible to be sure that we're not just putting something out there that's going to have many negative effects. So the bill works with the Attorney General's office as the primary arbiter of the justice of what's happening. So if there's an AI process that's going to be employed as a developer or a deployer of the AI system, there's different responsibilities, but we want people to know if an AI solution is actually being employed. If you send your resume to a company, you want to know that there's an AI system that could be screening that. If you're going to get a loan or you're going to get insurance or a decision on your insurance is going to be made, you want to know that that might be happening. So if you get denied and you say, well, how could I have been denied that? I know I'm very qualified. This shouldn't be happening. That you know it wasn't just a person who said no. It could have been an automated process, and you can get some relief through the Attorney General's office. There's no private right of action for the attorney in the room. That just means you can't sue personally, but you can seek the relief through the government to the Attorney General's office. And then the Attorney General can find out and look more deeply into that system to see if there was any kind of bias that was put into there, and then get some relief for that person. It's pretty high standard. The standard is a rebuttable presumption. I've said that in many different ways incorrectly over the last several months, but I finally got it right, and I say it right this time. Rebuttable presumption is a pretty high standard, so it's not going to be a standard that people are going to reach very easily, and that is by design. That was one of the compromises that we made in this policy, because we don't want everybody just saying, oh, well, this is discrimination and this can't be, and just trying to get the Attorney General to go after everybody. That would just become overburdensome. So we want real things to be looked into, but we want to make sure there is an avenue for relief. So deployer or developer is provided that from in its defense, if the system complies with the existing laws, and then efforts are made to try to find the biases and harms in there. And we want those companies also that if they identify a harm that they might come across in new versions, that they have to let us know. And I would make the analogy as to a recall in a car. If your car has a problem and the manufacturer realizes it, that they tell you that there's a problem with your car, so that way you can go get it fixed, because it might kill you in your car. It might crash or something, or the airbag will kill you. You want to know. It's very important information. So these are the kinds of things we want to be aware of when we are deploying these systems. At the same time, we recognize very much that there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of things that we can do with AI. There's a lot of processes. There's a lot of efficiencies. There's a lot of money to be made when it comes to AI. And yay, we like that. We want companies to succeed. We want companies to find the solutions that are going to make life easier for people. But we don't want people to get run over, to go back to the car analogy, in the process. So what we've been seeing over the years is the race to the AI, getting the product out and trying to train it with as much stuff as you can, and race towards the big pile of money that the AI is going to generate, and be there first with the wheelbarrow. And there's plenty of money to get to for everyone. But let's not hurt people along the way. And that's kind of where the government is stepping in here. We want to be a partner with the tech companies. I think it might be out of batteries, maybe. I think we want to be partners with the tech companies. We don't want to be the heavy hand of government. We don't want the companies to be regulated heavily because something goes terribly wrong and we find out that there's a major problem with one of these systems. We want to work with the companies to see how we can set up very sensible guide rails and even the playing field for everyone. Because what happens is you have one company that says, oh, well, hey, look at this self-regulation, it's great, everything's fine and no one's watching what we're doing. And if we do this thing, we can probably get around that and make a whole bunch of money. And yeah, we might hurt some people along the way, but we're going to get to this money first. We can deal with that later with all the money we're going to make with all the legal fees, and we can just cut that off. That could cause the government to put a major regulation in place, and then now we have problems getting in the way of the innovation. That's what we don't want to happen. And the other reason why we're trying to have a uniform policy is because AI is being used everywhere. It's not just being used here in Colorado, it's being used in all of the states. But can we rely on the federal government to pass a policy on AI regulation? I think the likelihood of that's gone down in the last month. So maybe we could have done that before, but now I don't see that really happening because now we're going to be racing for supremacy and that big pile of money that we're going to make all this money on, and that's where we're headed right now. And I just see that as more of a disaster to be racing too hard in an area where we just don't know what is even possible or what the ramifications are at this point. So we need to work to find those ways of keeping things on track and keeping things in a safe lane where people will not be run over and not be taken out in the process of building these systems. We in the legislature have a responsibility to the people we represent, the people who are applying for these jobs, trying to get insurance and trying to get law advice, whatever it is, and we want to make sure that the processes and the companies putting these things forward are actually doing it in a way that tries to eliminate that algorithmic bias as much as possible. And that's why we have this bill. We did have a task force that we formed along with the bill. Many of the tech companies just wanted the task force and not the bill, but we did both. And we said, we may not get everything completely right with the bill. We'll have a task force. We will focus on what the issues are. One of the members of the task force is here. It's a very big task force. We had a lot of conversations, and we did actually find some things that we can change with the law and tweak. We identified how a developer and a deployer could have a little bit of ambiguity there. If you have a developer that makes an LLM, which an LLM is not part of this bill, it's a large language model is not regulated by this because it does not on its own make a consequential decision. But if a deployer uses that to make a consequential decision, have they become a developer? And now are they responsible for the developer's responsibilities? And then where does that take the other developer in that responsibility for training the original model? So it kind of gets into a little bit of ambiguity. And then the burden that comes with regulation of making sure that there's plans in place for mitigation of AI bias and the legal things that they would have to do. For a small company, it may be difficult for them to do. But normally, we look at small businesses by a number of employees, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense in this case because you could have a company of 3 people who makes a great product and it gets out in front of a whole bunch of people and now it's being used by millions and millions and millions of people, and those people might be affected by this negative outcome. Are we supposed to exempt them because they have 3 people? That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So we were trying to devise a way of figuring out how small companies, and how do we define that, in this case, can be regulated in the same way. And if they're selling a product to millions of people, they're probably making a whole bunch of money on that, and they can afford to have the attorneys to come up with the mitigation plans that they're supposed to have. So these are the discussions we're working on right now, to have another bill this year to fix the little issues that we have. And we're also paying attention to that large group of legislators across the country who are having more conversations, because a lot of the states that wanted to do this and couldn't do this, they're going to be coming through this year and probably putting those bills forward for the first time. And they want a uniform policy, and we want to make sure we're aligning with the best thoughts that they have right now. So one of the consequential decisions of financial services, which is a very broad topic, it's a bit too broad. And what that group has come to the conclusion of is that more on the lending end of things might be more of a space where we want to narrow down what that topic is. So it's more about you getting a loan or not getting a loan than it is just any kind of financial services, which is a little bit too broad. So it's a work in progress. When the bill is introduced, which I have no idea when that will be, you can follow it on the legislative website. And if you have something you want to add to the conversation, you can always sign up to testify on the bill if you like. So when that comes up, feel free to reach out to me or check it out on the website. Question?
Yeah, I'm curious, since this came out, what was the biggest, I'll start with two things. What was the biggest positive surprise, and what was the biggest negative surprise out of this, getting this passed?
What was the biggest positive surprise, I guess, was that some of the tech companies really, because some companies have been saying that we need regulation. Like the AI companies have been coming out and saying, the CEOs of these companies have been saying that. And some of the tech organizations have been saying, well, we don't want to make this go away. We just want to make it tweaked. And they weren't really kind of going after it to erase it more than just fix it. And I think the surprise on the opposite end is more to say that it's a bit troubling how some topics are we just cannot find common ground on really yet. And in my line of work, if everybody's disappointed, that's a good thing. But nobody likes to be disappointed, and unfortunately. So that's kind of where we're at right now, is trying to find that happy medium. Yes?
Yeah, I have no doubt that there's plenty of companies racing where the wheelbarrow for the pile of money. But what I'll call the blue sky crowd in the AI research community has a very different take on it, which is that there are wonderful advantage society waiting out there, cures of cancer, that if your work pushes those back 6 months, 10,000 people are going to die that wouldn't die otherwise. And so their argument against the regulation is not keeping people from money. It's keeping huge benefits to society from happening sooner than they would have otherwise.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Actually, before we go there, that sounds like a perfect question for the panel we're going to have in a few minutes. So I want to revisit that when we've got everybody on the panel, because that's like literally where I want, kind of the direction I want to go is like good, bad on legislation. So I did have one more question for you though, which was do we still have a conversation going on with other states, and is there still some cooperation going on as far as figuring out sort of a national strategy?
Yeah. The coalition of all the different state legislators is still ongoing, and we are looking at what they're talking about as we get our bill moving along. So the conversation's not over. This is a topic that we have to continue to talk about as this evolves. This is not just a one and done thing. We need to continue this conversation for the foreseeable future as this technology evolves.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Okay. I'm going to need Anna. It's Zoom time. So while we're getting this set up, We have a remote conversation going on. Somebody asked to be on the panel today, and just to introduce her, I would like to introduce Henriette Cramer, who's coming in from San Francisco, and for personal reasons couldn't be here today. She's a consultant, a researcher, and the former head of Algorithmic Impact, Trust and Safety at Spotify. She's a researcher and founder of papermoon.ai, which is focused on AI quality and risk management, and has extensive experience in both product and research, recommenders, search and bot and voice interaction. Prior, she was the director of Algorithmic Impact and Responsibility at Spotify, where she led the company-wide policy and algorithmic impact assessment and built out the trust and safety data science team. She got her industry metrics and trust and safety start at Yahoo and holds many patents and 60+ research publications. So with that, I'm going to ask Henriette a couple of questions, then we're going to have a panel where we'll bring back Henriette and all of our other speakers. And I want to go more deeply into the future of AI regulation and governance and where safety exists and where it doesn't. So Henriette, you set up the Algorithmic Impact and Responsibility effort, which I just said for the third time. Can you tell us what that is and what that effort is and what's the goal of algorithmic impact and responsibility? What are you trying to prevent? What's a good outcome for a company?
It's an excellent question, because things like goal ambiguity are really, really difficult for these types of efforts. So I'll give you a little bit of history. So I was working at Spotify. I had set up teams for example, voice data and research with, hey, Spotify, play me something cool. You'll find issues with, hey, what are these systems really good at and what are they not so good at? And also at that time, especially having a research background, you go to a lot of different research events, and really that discussion around algorithmic bias and fairness really started to come up. So why we originally started this effort was basically from a research sense to go, hey, these discussions are happening now. Can we actually translate that external research into methods that work for example, music recommendation? Or, hey, the questions that product teams have about the decisions that they should be making, can we actually find methods in the literature that we can adjust to these product settings? But when it basically moved from, okay, it's no longer just research, we're actually turning this into a larger product and policy effort, there's a bunch of different motivations that come together. So the first is, as you just heard, things like legal compliance are extremely important, right? Like, what can you use data for? What can you not for? You don't want every single engineer in a large company to actually have to think that through themselves. You want to set clear standards with what's okay, what's not okay. Second part is you actually care about your social impact as a large company, right? Not just from a, hey, you actually want to understand what your systems are doing, but also from your messaging and stakeholders. You can't just go, oh, we'll just do whatever and our relationships externally don't affect us. That's not true. So it's really important to go, what's our social impact? What are the stakeholders? What are their questions about what's happening on a platform? And also a very practical reason, you want to build a better product and you want to go faster. So if you have efforts like these that actually really clearly set what are our quality standards, what are the biases you want to be aware of, and how do you solve this, you can actually go faster and serve more different audiences. So that were these different goals, and then over the years it morphed into different types of setups. And just generally, any organization in practice that needs to do this type of work, there's really going from those abstract concerns with, oh, responsible AI, we should be doing something, to, okay, what does this mean for this organization? The second is that, like, the organizational structure, how are we going to execute this? Who is doing what? Which teams should be involved? What are they doing that? And then the consideration of, hey, you don't know everything internally. Which research communities, which organizations do you have to work with? And how do we get feedback on those types of decisions, whether it's from legal, from research, or from more societal organizations? So it's really this large amorphous different things that come together, and you have to create structure as a company to actually fulfill all those different types of goals and create clarity about what you're trying to achieve in there.
So can you give me like a specific example of what we're talking about as far as a bad outcome with bias or, unexpected results of data science inside of Spotify?
So there's a couple of different things you can actually look up the papers of various teams. For example, you may, from even a product quality, but also a just impact perspective, you want to make sure that you have diversity in your recommendations, right? You don't want to, very basic, you don't want all the recommendations to be exactly the same. That every time you open the app, you get exactly the same type of results. That doesn't make sense. That's not entertaining, but it's also bad for different groups of artists. So that's one. And then a very practical one where you can also much more easily, if you're going into a company and try and get momentum for this type of effort, let's say you're doing a voice interaction, you go, hey, play me some really cool music, or play me some music from this particular genre. If you don't understand the language that whole groups of your users are using, or the descriptions that artists want to have about themselves, you're just creating a bad product that can't be used, which is also not inclusive, right? So to create momentum for these type of efforts, definitely these types of, hey, where is that intersection between both product quality and the impact that a product has? And then obviously there's also questions that may come in, but for example, okay, what is gender representation in recommendations, where you then have to go, okay, how can we translate this into concrete methods and even figure out where we are?
So what are the types of work and types of workers, for that matter, that are required in order to do these kinds of research? And what does that look like in an active company the size of Spotify?
Yeah, and again, a lot of these things apply to a lot of different organizations, right? But the translation between very different types of work and different types of teams. So first, there's the research and data science with what are we even trying to measure? Like you, for example, work on ML Commons on benchmarks, but you can't just go, oh, I'm just grabbing these benchmarks and plonk, these just work for my product or my company. You need to do that type of translation. Then there's a second bucket with, hey, you have your risk management team, you have your legal team, you have your policy team. They need to set standards, but those standards, if in policy language, don't match up with, oh, this is the line of code that this engineer needs to do, or hey, this product team has a question about whether they can use this training data or they can't use that, or what the consequences even are of that. So there's the research side, the product team, and the standards across the whole company and how do you educate. And then there is obviously also a whole communications angle to this, with how do you explain this? How do you set up, for example, safety boards or advisory boards to get advice externally? So the biggest challenge of an effort like this is definitely that translation, and that the interpretation of even the terminology can be very different. So folks who come from a machine learning background may hear very different things for the same terms as your legal team, as your trust and safety folks. And it's slowly getting closer together, but we're still in a translation moment as just a wider industry.
Yeah, I can relate. At ML Commons, we probably spent half of the last year just discussing what taxonomy we're going to use to even define harm before we can even say, well, how do we figure out whether that harm is occurring? So it's a huge, deep conversation to just figure out how to get started, right? So let's have the fun question. Can you give us a tale or two from the trenches when things went wildly wrong? What happened? How did you handle it? And to bring it sort of full circle back to governance, how did the company structurally react in order to fix the problems that were occurring?
Yeah, I'm actually, since we're in a little bit of an audience that's fairly like research and student oriented, I'm going to keep it to some of the lessons learned for myself of how would I have done this slightly differently if I had done it from scratch next time.
Yeah.
Also, this is also the types of conversations I have now, being like someone who works on advice and tooling for other companies, right? So there's a couple of things you really want to anticipate. So, for example, do not underestimate the communication side and that goal ambiguity. Because you may think like, oh, this is fantastic. I got the whole company to buy into this whole effort. Here we've delivered 100+ algorithmic impact assessments. This is an enormous success. We've learned so much about how we can avoid certain harms, or the methods that different teams have that other teams can learn about. And you think, did a great job. This is fantastic. But if other teams think that this whole effort is about something completely different, like one team may go, yes, this whole effort is about creating wonderful marketing material. Another team may go, oh, this whole effort is about making it very clear what content moderation is. And another team may go, this should be making us super fast. And you're sitting there with your, like, this has been a great success, while all these other teams may be going, wait, what were we doing? Why did we spend all of this time? So really outlining much clearer with what are the steps in this process? Why are we doing this? And why are we prioritizing this one versus this problem that you may be encountering? And especially when you do this at scale, because you want to do it as efficiently as possible. And obviously from a research community perspective, we're often talking about, oh, let's do it in a very holistic way and let's really get a complete insight, which is not necessarily the same way as agile teams would operate. So would really, really advise what are the smallest wins that you can actually communicate to folks with these different goals. So that's one. And then the other side is underestimating the technical work that needs to happen. Like you may go, oh, really large companies, they know everything. Or it's super easy to just pull data and understand what is being recommended or what is being searched for. In a lot of cases, you might find with, oh, wait, data lineage is actually really complicated. Or oh, this is really easy if I do this on a controlled data set that I used for a paper. But, oh, wait, how do you do this if there's millions of data points coming in every day? Or who is even the data provider that can help figure out the characteristics of what is being recommended? And you have to really think through is this actually doable technically? And the interesting thing for us from a research perspective was that some of these methods were actually the research projects with, okay, step one, you need to scope. Step two, you actually need to make sure that this is technically implementable. And then, okay, you measured something, but then what? Who is actually doing something? So some of those lessons learned are definitely more about the communication and creating organizational structure, and not necessarily just focusing on, oh, fantastic, I have this data science problem to look at bias. And it's more about that wider ecosystem that you've created because you started an effort at scale at a company.
Right, yeah. And hidden bias is probably at least at this point, our biggest single problem is not bias that's easy to measure, but bias that you discover as the result of unexpected outcomes. Yeah. And yeah, I highly recommend the book. It's a couple of years old now, but The Alignment Problem by Brian Christensen, he gets in very deeply into some of the issues of why we get unexpected results, not just in LLMs, but in data science in general, where you're measuring one thing that seems like the obvious thing to measure to do the thing that you need to do, and it turns out you're still getting these weird outcomes, and it's for a reason that you never would have guessed up front. For example, in a lot of these image models, they were primarily trained on the same very large data set, which was a research project by a university, Fei Li's project, which collected this huge number of images. They're not evenly distributed. The stuff that we get out of there has run into all sorts of strange problems, including the famous gorilla problem, which is why most image The most image identifiers even now will never identify anything as a gorilla, because that was the solution to solving the problem, that there was a very limited number of images of people who are dark-skinned enough it would just start identifying all of them as being gorillas. They didn't like that, so they pulled that out as the ability to define a term, which is causing another class of dysfunctions. Now it's just like they don't exist as far as that language is concerned, right? As opposed to solving the problem. So we see hundreds of these. That's just a really, typical example that you hear a lot about when we're discussing dysfunctions in data science. Let's jump into the panel discussion since we're at almost 7:30. So what I'd like to do is get Philip and Brianna back, and I'd like to introduce John Nordmark, who some of you will recognize as having been a speaker here a couple of months ago. He's the CEO of Iterate.ai, former founder of eBags, and more importantly for this panel, he's on the Citizens Advisory Board, the technical committee who's helping advise SB 205. So the way I'd like to run this, just so everybody understands, I'm going to ask a couple of general questions to kick things off, and then we're going to make this an open Q&A for the audience. And as long as we don't run out of steam, we'll keep it going until a few minutes before 8 when we need to abandon the room. Henriette will be joining us remotely, and then our three guests here. So with that, I'm going to open with a question for everybody that is just an extremely broad question. What is your perspective on AI regulation in general? What are we trying to accomplish? I'm going to start off with my quick answer, okay? Since I do teach this. So for me, there's basically three aspects of good AI regulation. AI regulation needs to be obvious. You need to know whether or not you're covered by the regulation. AI regulation needs to be consistent and enforceable, which basically means it's easy for the person to understand the regulations. They don't have to hire lawyers to basically define what's in the regulation in the first place. And there need to be tools that make it cheap to actually comply. By the way, the state of the tools right now is there is no AI regulation that's easy to comply with right now. It just doesn't exist. They're trying. We'll get back to that. But that's our North Star as far as where we want to get to. So if you're a small company who needs to comply with the regulation, you instantly know those three things, and you know what it takes to actually get there. With that, I'll pass it on to our panel. I'm going to start just because the order that you're in. Actually, I'll start with you, John. You got the mic.
Okay. First of all, I'm on the AI task force with Representative Titone, and the governor's office and the legislators asked me to join it and mainly provide a perspective on from a startup point of view. And I think one other thing that I learned about, I'm not that political person, so I learned a lot about politics by being on this task force, and I found out there are a ton of opinions. Like, it is very, very difficult to come to that place, I guess, where Representative Titone wants to be, where everyone's upset, and there were shouting matches. But anyway, I appreciate very much that they asked for me to represent the startups and also deployers. The thing that I like is that it's targeting high risk. And I like that the groups have decided to try to fine tune that, because if you're just trying to figure out, like the example Representative Titone said, if financial services, if that's considered high risk, like what in the world? If we're building AI, my company builds AI, if we're building it and it remotely touches anything like that, we're going to be all worried about it. And from a startup perspective, we don't have a lawyer. Well, we do, but she's doing contracts all day, for big companies we work with. But we don't have like these policy committees and those kind of things, or policy people. I learned Google has like 400 people on staff, that do that all the time. So I think what you said, Ken, is really important, that whatever comes out and is turned into law needs to be really simple for us people in the startup community to understand and comply with. I hope they're tools that are built by other startups or by big companies that help us know whether or not we're in compliance, and they're really easy to use. If that happens, I think this is good. But those are the points of view I tried to get across in this activity I've been involved in.
Brianna?
This is really hard. This is really hard to do, to regulate a brand new industry that changes very rapidly. So, we are not going to get it fully right the first time, and that's why we set up a task force, and that's why we set the implementation date ahead, so the law would not go into effect right away. We want to make sure that we get this right and have the conversations and understand it. But as I mentioned, a lot of those AI startup CEOs, they said very clearly, we have to have some kind of regulation in place. How do we set that up? I mean, everybody's got their own way to do it. We are trying to do it, having this conversation across the country with different regulators to make sure we can have that perspective from all different angles. And maybe everybody will be a little bit upset. And I think that's a good thing, because that means we have to give up a little bit in the regulation, but we don't want to lose track of what that innovation is going to be, and that benefit to society as well.
For me, I'm not obviously not a legislative person. However, I think there are two things that I care about more than anything else, and that is primarily around issues of surveillance, right? And secondarily around data ownership, right? One of the things that we're building at the Institute at ILIF is working towards a data trust, whereby we can build a critical mass of data that people can claim as their own. And so if you have any, without going into a larger spiel, right, I wrote an article that came out last year in the Georgetown Law Journal about what it might mean for data to be considered the extension of a fiscal body. And so if whatever I do in a digital realm or a space that builds data is a reflection of myself and treated as myself, what might happen that way. And so those are the things that we care about, at least from my perspective, in terms of what are the things that might be regulated. Now, in terms of a more general approach, I think our assumption, and even I think our basic operating principle is that in the U.S., industry is going to shape legislation. And so I think this conversation is interesting around what might happen from a legislative perspective, but given the way that the history of the U.S. works, companies and industry often are the ones that help to mold and form these things. And so in many ways, that's part of the reason why we are working to enter this space, right, from an industry kind of perspective, especially around data ownership and around surveillance, so that as influence within the large industry takes shape, all right, then we can maybe have a larger voice at the table when we start having conversations about what might be legislated and regulated.
Henriette.
I apologize if I say something that's already been said, because it's a little hard for me to hear right now. But on the regulation side, so I think it's extremely important to have very clear regulation, so it's clear what needs to be done or what you want to see when you're auditing a system, for example. Something that I find really important as someone who likes building and understanding the impact is also that when looking at regulation or looking at incentives through like governmental mitigations in some way, is that it's not only about the regulation of what can we do, what can we not do, but also thinking about, hey, how do you create a larger ecosystem of alternatives? So for example, that you don't end up in a situation where, hey, there's lots of rules, they're really complicated to understand, so now really large audit firms get all the business versus, hey, there's a chance for a lot of different startups to do their work. So really thinking about those larger incentives as well, and not only the rules, especially when setting like policy for whether it's in the US or Europe or worldwide, other policies with, hey, what are the created incentives and how does that impact potential alternatives for the larger companies?
That makes sense. So what is the best way to balance, I'll start with you this time, Henriette, to balance public safety with speed of innovation? You talked about this a little bit earlier. And what's that mean about the regulations you're trying to create?
Yeah, do you mind moving behind the desk and repeating what you just said?
I can do that.
Thank you.
All right. So my question was, what's the best way to balance public safety with speed of innovation? How's that going to affect regulation?
So it's a really interesting question, because this is the biggest gap you also see when the building and prototyping is much faster than very thoughtful data-informed policy, especially when you're building something that you haven't encountered before and that you're thinking about the different decisions that you can make and there's no clear answer. So it's, in a side of an organization, it's more about like baking in the space to actually be able to do that type of investigation. Whereas in a larger setting, like societal setting, it would be how can you actually level the playing field more so there's not an incentive to just only run fast and everyone else is left behind. So really appreciating very, very thoughtful ways of doing that, but it is a fundamental challenge that we really haven't solved in this area, especially with things are actually speeding up right now versus, okay, you have the time to actually reflect on what's going on. On the more tooling side, like the easier it becomes to make compliance tooling, observability tooling, to go, hey, is this going off the rails? Like there's a really big opportunity for tools there, and that's been really interesting prototyping on that type of work.
So anyone else want to answer that question? I'll ask it one more time just to remember. So we're asking, how do you balance public safety with the speed of innovation? Kind of goes back to what you were asking earlier, which is, okay, there are benefits to innovating as fast as possible. You know, some of them are, we don't want other countries to leapfrog us, but some of us are, well, if you are going to solve big problems, which is unfortunately non-predictable, how do you balance how quickly we innovate with the problems that we might cause in the meantime?
Yeah, I think that there's an assumption that balance is like existent in this particular process. I think even more so, I think for us, I think one of the things that we're moving towards is precision-based technology over predictive, which would then suggest that, which also goes to our idea of localization, something I didn't really have time to talk about in the talk. And what that means is that in the conversation around prototyping, I think as Henriette was offering for us, is something to think about what it means, right, to create solutions for local communities in localized spaces, recognizing that an attempt to do things at scale at all times is, I think it's fundamentally why we end up with harm, because we're suggesting that a solution or a particular tool is going to be good for everybody when we recognize it often, right, as we're making a tool, right, there's an end user in mind. That very specific end user probably is the one that we need to be focusing on and find out where that person lives and where those communities are. And so if we can think about what it means to prototype and retool in local spaces, I think that there's a lot more in terms of what it means to think about an ecosystem, whether it be the physical ecosystem or the social ecosystem or the technological ecosystem, given that these spaces are going to respond and receive these technologies in a much different way. So I think it's a different kind of approach to prototyping, focus grouping, and things of that nature.
Brianna?
I just say one thing briefly, because we saw not too long ago that one chatbot resulted in a youth taking his life. Maybe they didn't see that coming. I don't think that website got taken down. I don't think any warning was put on there. But like, these are the kinds of things that I worry about, are these ramifications, and that wouldn't even cover under my bill. The bill that we put in place, it wouldn't even, those are not covered, those chatbots. And to your question about the research in medical stuff, that's also not covered in this bill. This is not going to change any of that. We're trying to not have the collateral damage of people getting hurt in the process of these things being developed. That's what we're trying to do. And as someone who's a lawmaker, and I represent the people and all of the people who may be using and being impacted by these kinds of things, they need someone to look out for their interests. And that's what these regulations are really all about. We don't want to stop the companies from making all the money that they want to make, but don't knock everybody over in the process and be reckless, be thoughtful, and we can all have a great outcome in the end of the day.
For me, again, coming from my company's 100 people, not long ago we were 6. And the biggest thing is not putting too much burden of like all these proactive disclosures and, having to write up every algorithm you produce, having to explain what they do, because most people won't understand them anyway. I mean 99.9% of people won't understand the type of math our people do and that. But I think as much as you can legislate on the outcomes, you don't want these terrible outcomes like what was just mentioned. A bad outcome's a bad outcome, and that's what people should get in trouble for. But if all this proactive work has to be done, I think it'll really slow down. Like that won't balance the innovation side of this equation. The other thing is my company has a number of patents we've filed for in the AI space and been granted already. One thing that certain groups are pushing for is really the disclosure of what we would consider trade secrets. And we don't, I think that would be terrible. One, we don't want to disclose it to larger companies out there, because the people that could understand what we're doing are the people that work at our competitors. And the people in China and Russia, they'll understand it, like the people that work on AI in those countries. But we think that those types of things should be kept private with the legislators who can understand it, whether it's in the Attorney General office or whatever. But that's my 2 cents.
All right, let's go ahead and open up the audience to questions.
Okay, I have the mic here. Usually we try and give first shot to students. So do any students have a question? We'll start there. If not, we'll open it up. So first call, students. Any questions from students? Okay. Going once? All right, general audience questions. Right here, sir.
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about the intent of regulation and how it's been traditionally sort of deployed in the real world. I think, one of the questions that was asked at the beginning, are you in favor of self-regulation from companies or government? I raised my hand for government because I do believe that you need somebody who's external to the process and thereby impartial, sort of overseeing things to drive that accountability. I think the difficulty with regulation that I've seen in the past, however, is that it tends to concentrate power in the hands of a small set of companies that are equipped to deal with that regulation, which I think is why you're seeing, a large number of CEOs from large companies saying, yeah, let's regulate, because in every case, like I can name, that ends up with like sort of these hegemonies. So can someone answer for me, like what is being paid attention to in the legislative process here that like helps at least ameliorate those effects?
I'm 100% in agreement with everything you just said, because I believe in legislation too. I do think we got to watch out for the bad things, but man, as being part of this, you wouldn't believe, like people flew in from all over the country, from every big company, IBM, Microsoft, Google, I can't remember all of them, but they all came in to talk to us. And then you have all these groups like the Center for Democracy and Technology that, wants everything disclosed, and they get they're lawyers, they're very good at this. our community, like you just said, if the regulation gets too heavy, it makes it easier for the biggest companies to comply. The people that get squeezed out are the innovators, the people trying to change the game a little bit. And the people who, especially the bootstrappers, which, 99% of startups never raise money. They bootstrap it, and they can't afford to be hiring the kind of lawyers you need if this is too tough to monitor. They can't afford to even get in the game. And so I do appreciate, like I said in the beginning, like I was invited to be part of this. And what I did see is they listened to me, but what I also learned by watching I don't think I'm nearly close to the smartest person in the room there. And I'm just one little voice, and all these really smart people from lots of big companies come in to make sure their points heard. And so I don't know. I mean, all I can say is I was invited to represent kind of what you talked about, but I don't know how that's going to factor into the rest of this. There was a venture firm that came in and talked on behalf of some startups. There were some others, but for sure it's weighted way toward the big companies.
This is one of the issues we're trying to grapple with, is how do we be fair to smaller companies to be able to innovate. But we also have to think about that these small companies may make something that causes a lot of harm. And are we going to let them have no responsibility to cause as much harm as they want because there's no regulation that applies to them because they're a small company and they get a free pass? I mean, that's what makes it so challenging, is how do we make it as less burdensome for them as we can, but still have a set of rules that applies to everyone. And that's what we're trying to grapple with, and not necessarily the size of the company, but more maybe on the amount of income that the company makes that starts to have these regulations. And these are the conversations we're trying to figure out for this updated policy as to what's fair and what actually will work. And of course, not everyone's going to be happy with it.
Yeah, let me follow on. I think one of the things that hopefully you guys can hear me. I tried to do it. I think we see a lot of talk about like how burdensome or how large those regulations are and how much effort has to be put into it. I'm wondering if there's a way that there's another dimension that could be applied to this, whereby support for the smaller companies is coming alongside the bill, whereby the companies themselves can be. You have the regulations, because to your point, there are plenty of small companies doing unethical things or accidentally unethical things. But having the support for a company to be able to do that testing and to have some more of a process that a larger company has access to would ameliorate those effects greatly.
So let's just have one speaker answer that, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I think that what really needs to happen is that the large companies, with all of their essentially infinite resources, should come together to help the smaller companies if they really believe in furthering the technology and making the regulations less burdensome for them, that they take a little bit of that responsibility on. I don't think that the government's going to force anybody to do that, but I think that the companies should do it, because if they really believe in this technology, that's the right thing to do. And the state of Colorado has like negative money right now, so we can't help you out.
Okay, next question here in the back.
Thanks. Yeah, so similar question. Compute thresholds have been a big part of regulation thus far. EU AI Act, Biden's EO, the now vetoed SB 1047 in California, largely for that reason. Especially with the rise of the reasoning models, where training compute isn't quite as important. It's inference compute where it's shifted to. I'm kind of curious, what is the temperature at the state level regulation? Is compute just out the window now as a means of triggering transparency and regulation, or is it still part of the equation of what might be, what states coalesce given the federal government's not going to do anything?
Well, I think what we're really trying to do right now is focus on what we have, which is really kind of a foundational, basic, consequential decision, really things that are going to have a major impact on people. that's what we're focused on. We're trying to get other states to also focus on that and come up with that standardized model. And then if we need to later on, we can build on that. But we want to make sure we have other states following along the same kind of framework. So that way it's really easy for every company who's out there to be able to comply with it. I know that Texas is kind of doing a little bit of a different thing, and Connecticut's working with us, and a couple other states kind of going in a little bit different directions. But we should really try to be uniform on this policy, because the federal government's unlikely to do something uniform for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. The bill is really focused just on these consequential decisions and then trying to determine what is high risk. And I think if that can get tight, the definitions around, even the definition of artificial intelligence gets tight, then we all know what we need to comply with. And if it's written in as plain English as possible, that will be good. But there's nothing around compute. And on the startup piece of this again, we've talked about tiers, all kinds of things. And like, it can't be on people. It could be on revenue. It could be on money raised. Like if someone raises $100 million, they should be able to comply. And we've actually talked about what should the tier level be on a money raise. And so there, all of these things are kind of being considered and will be, hopefully, something will end up in the final law.
Okay, next question from Mike, and we have about 10 minutes left.
As a general legal principle, you try to regulate harms rather than means. And so, because when you regulate means rather than harms, you tend to get ridiculous results. So a couple of examples. One, I know Representative Hughes used this. AI mimics the voice of a grandson. It used to call up grandparents and say, "Hey, I'm in trouble. I need money. Wire me money." That's fraud. That's intentional misrepresentation to get something of value. When you add the means of AI, you just add a third thing that has to be proved. So you've made it harder. Second, in employment decisions, if you've got software versus artificial intelligence software, both softwares, let's say, produce a bad result, are against African Americans. It should not be a defense for the company that the company did not use AI, that the company just wrote. If school equals Howard University, reject. But when you regulate the means of AI rather than the harm of discrimination, that's what you get. And then finally, for non-consensual intimate imagery, AI porn, if you went to someone who was victimized by AI porn and told them, "Hey, we understand that your likeness is out there and it was synthesized and it's not real, but we've looked into it and it was actually just done with ordinary image manipulation software. It wasn't done with AI at all," that person would probably look at you like you'd gone a second head that didn't work any better than the first one and say, "I don't care whether it was or was not done with AI. I care that my image is out there all over the place. It's not me." So what's the justification for making it harder to prosecute, allowing arbitrary things to still produce bad results, and having the harmed parties not regulating things that the harmed parties don't care about, like whether they were harmed by AI or not?
Those are some of the points we were trying to make too, especially in the means versus the harms. Like when we're building a model, like we do nanomodels and small models that are just distilled down from the large models, there's so much experimentation, and then it's never done. You're just always refining and trying to make it better, and that's why we just think it would be very it'd slow things down so much if you just have to be reporting on every change you make to a model. That would be impossible, really. Mm-hmm. If we could have the testing tools, if tools are made that allow you to run tests quickly and cheaply, that's good. We're doing that right now with some of our models, but the tool we're using cost us $100,000. you know, and most little companies could never spend that. And so, you know, the more this can be moved to the harms, to your point, the better, and away from the means, the better.
Well, let me talk about that for a second. So, as the academic. So the big thing that's changing is the democratization and how easy it is to build things which are fundamentally problematic now. So you never want to not have a law around the harms, because that's the primary law that you do want to fight, is that you can't do this fraud. But on the other hand, if your 13-year-olds can go to an online site and go build all of the stuff that's now required to do it without any additional work, we've just created a much more dangerous world, right? So a lot of these harm prevention things around it is like, if you're going to produce AI that's capable of people using this for various uses in very simple cases, that shouldn't be generally available, or if it is generally available, it needs to be generally available with a whole bunch of caveats. So that's really sort of the general theory behind this stuff, is we've now gotten to the point where anybody can go build a deep fake. That wasn't true 3 years ago. You at least needed some decent Photoshop talent. Now, you can just go to a website and do it. These things were not true until very recently, so the capacity for harm at this point is much higher. And there's also a bunch of other arguments about societal harms and other things like this. If everybody starts doing it, what does that mean? I'm not going to get into those because I think those are more on the philosophical side of things. But just in general, the thing to remember is that we now have a set of tools we didn't used to have. I mean, you can't buy a bandsaw that doesn't have a protector on it to keep you from sticking your finger into the bandsaw, and you can still get in there and do it if you want to. But that is a dangerous tool in general, and we've put some common sense laws in place to go say, well, you know, if you don't, you can go sue the saw company because they were stupid not to do that in the first place. So it's really more on that side of the law. It's almost more about consumer protection than it is about, you know, any sort of actual harm. But you know, level 0 is identify the harms. So that's, for me at least, the basic answer to that question is that we need to realize that this is not the same world we were living in 5 years ago.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes. I'm pleased to have Boulder City Council member Taisha Adams joining us. She has the next question.
Thank you so much, Dan. Good evening. Thank you so much for this timely panel. I did have a question. I appreciate the conversations around the unacceptable risks. And I was curious about some of the movement around high risk, particularly around infrastructure and specifically around energy and water usage. And so curious if there are conversations or what conversations are being had around water and energy, particularly I know there are data centers, and I know that there are some legislators at the State House currently considering some legislation around data centers and water use and energy use, considering that we are in a mega drought. So just curious if you have been involved in some conversations around water and energy. Thank you.
I'm going to pass this to Representative Titone, but our company actually, we've been really focused on that. That's why we're trying to use nano and small language models and do a lot of processing on the edge, even using CPU, tiny CPU, GPU, NPU infrastructures, and also Qualcomm chips that weren't even built for AI, you know, to run large language models. So we believe we build sustainable AI. But to your point, like every prompt that goes into ChatGPT takes 10 to 100 times more energy than a Google search. And, you know, we're building nuclear power plants to power these data centers now to try to make it clean energy that's running them, but it's a big deal, so.
Yeah, I'm not personally involved in any of these policies that are coming out, but we're very cognizant of the fact that the usage of AI is really putting a huge demand on the resources, and we've been working very hard to try to get a lot of our energy grid on more green energy sources, and now it's becoming more taxed, and we have to respond to that. So it's quite a bit of a quandary that's happened very quickly, and this demand has come up so fast that getting more things on the grid is going to be a bit challenging, and it's going to be contrary to what the state goals have been set. If we have to put more gas-powered electricity on the grid, that's going to cut into what our goals are. So how do we respond to that, and how can we, as a state that doesn't have a lot of money, actually do anything about it?
Yeah, and I guess at the Institute, we're beginning to have conversations now about if we're thinking about this in localized spaces, like not only what are the local impacts of like individual communities, which communities are predominantly impacted over others, and then what are different ways that we can use these resources in these local spaces, right, that would then provide not only a bit more sustainable approach, right, but almost reimagine what it means, right, to use these resources and maybe find other ways or other resources that might be amenable and replace the ones that are more heavily used at the moment.
Okay, we are out of time. Roger, I'm sorry we didn't get back to your question, but feel free to ask the panel in person. Please join me in thanking the panel.